January 1945. A bitter wind swept through the shattered streets of Bavaria. Smoke still curled from burned-out factories, and the distant rumble of artillery echoed like a ghostly drumbeat. German women, weary and hollow-eyed, gathered at the edges of the town square, clutching tattered coats and threadbare scarves. Their eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, flickered with cautious hope as an unfamiliar sound reached them. The sharp, disciplined cadence of American boots on cobblestones. From the haze emerged the first units of the U.S. Army, their uniforms crisp against the ruined landscape, their faces calm but alert. Mothers, daughters, and grandmothers peered from shattered windows, unsure whether to flee or approach. A few soldiers knelt to speak gently to children, offering candy and small comforts. The women exchanged incredulous glances, moments of normalcy in a world consumed by chaos. Then, a surprising instruction: small family reunions would be allowed. Tears welled, laughter broke through fear, and for the first time in months, civilians felt a flicker of control in their lives. The war still raged, yet in this small, improbable act, the human spirit showed its resilience. This was not just liberation. It was a quiet, emotional reclaiming of life. The scene, ephemeral but unforgettable, set the stage for what these women and the liberators would never forget. By early 1945, Germany was a nation unraveling. The Third Reich, once a formidable military force, had been pushed back on nearly every front. From the frozen banks of the Rhine to the ruined cities of the Ruhr, Allied advances were relentless. The German army, stretched thin and demoralized, struggled to maintain order as shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies crippled both troops and civilians. Cities burned from relentless Allied bombing campaigns, and entire neighborhoods lay in ash. Smoke hung in the air, carrying the bitter scent of destruction, while displaced families navigated streets strewn with rubble and debris. American forces, fresh from the liberation of France and the grim battles of the Ardennes, were now advancing deep into Western Germany. The Rhineland campaign had begun in February 1945, with American divisions crossing the Rhine and pushing eastward toward the heart of the collapsing German state. These operations were carefully orchestrated, combining infantry, armor, and artillery in precise coordination. Soldiers were trained not only to fight, but also to maintain discipline in the occupied areas, a necessity as civilians were often trapped between retreating German units and advancing Allied forces. Amid this military advance, the civilian population lived in constant uncertainty. German women, in particular, bore the weight of survival. Many were widowed or separated from husbands and sons serving on distant fronts. Children, often orphaned or semi-abandoned, clung to their mothers or neighbors for protection. Rations were scarce, hospitals overwhelmed, and social services effectively non-existent. Yet, even in these conditions, communities sought to maintain some sense of normalcy. Small markets, whispered conversations, and tentative gatherings in ruined courtyards. Every act of daily life was shadowed by the omnipresent fear of bombardment, reprisals, or advancing soldiers of the enemy. The arrival of American troops brought a new tension. News had traveled ahead. Rumors of the Allied Army's reputation for discipline, fairness, and occasional humanitarian acts spread among German civilians. Women in towns near the Rhine and Bavaria had been warned to expect harsh occupation, but were unsure whether fear or relief would dominate. The first glimpses of American uniforms sparked a mixture of hope and dread. Soldiers, carrying rifles and walking with measured purpose, approached towns with both caution and efficiency. Their presence was unmistakable, yet surprisingly calm compared to the chaos that had preceded them. In towns like Würzburg, Ansbach, and smaller Bavarian villages, civilians observed from shattered windows and doorways. German women, often responsible for scavenging and feeding families under extreme hardship, felt the full weight of both anticipation and fear. Many had lived through years of propaganda, bombings, and food shortages. Now, They faced an unfamiliar army whose language, mannerisms, and conduct were unlike any they had known. Initial encounters were tense. A woman stepping onto a snow-covered street might be met with a polite nod from a soldier, an offer of food, or simply a quiet instruction to remain calm. Every gesture carried significance, as civilians tried to gauge whether these were conquerors or liberators. It was in this delicate balance that small, regulated acts of humanity began to occur. American officers understood that winning the hearts of civilians could be as strategically important as defeating remaining German units. Military reports indicate that units were given specific instructions to avoid unnecessary violence, distribute rations when possible, and allow temporary gatherings where local populations could reconnect with separated family members. These were modest permissions, but to war-weary women and children, they were extraordinary. The psychological impact on German women cannot be overstated. After years of fear, indoctrination, and exhaustion, witnessing soldiers treating civilians with respect elicited a profound emotional response. Some wept quietly behind curtains. Others stepped outside cautiously, clutching children or small bundles of possessions. There were moments of disbelief, as everyday human decency seemed suddenly foreign. Soldiers permitted women to approach with questions, offer small gifts, or request aid for elderly relatives. The war had taught suspicion, yet these interactions created a fragile bridge of trust, setting the stage for what would become the first small reunions. From the rubble-strewn streets, a subtle transformation began. Civilians, and particularly women, sensed that the end of conflict was near. The American approach, disciplined, humane, and methodical, allowed these towns to slowly reclaim a sense of order. Streets once silent under fear now held cautious conversations. Windows, broken and soot-stained, revealed faces filled with tentative hope. And as small gestures of care spread through the towns, the stage was set for moments of laughter and tears, moments that would linger in memory long after the last battles had ended. This fragile optimism naturally led to the second stage of the background. How these American forces actively facilitated the reunions that would stun and move German women. As American forces advanced deeper into southern Germany, the landscape of war shifted from strategic maneuvers to humanitarian concern. Towns once fully under Nazi control were now uncertain zones. Local administrations had collapsed or fled, leaving civilians, particularly women and children, to navigate the chaos alone. Military reports from March and April 1945 emphasized that American commanders were acutely aware of this civilian vulnerability. Units were instructed to maintain order, prevent looting, and most importantly, treat civilians with respect, even amidst the lingering dangers of combat and unexploded ordnance. In this context, small reunions began to emerge as a sanctioned part of the liberation effort. Soldiers would allow mothers to reconnect with sons returning from forced labor, or daughters to locate older relatives who had been separated by bombings and evacuations. These gatherings were modest in scale, often limited to a single courtyard or town square, but they represented a profound human gesture. Reports from the 3rd and 7th U.S. Armies describe how officers encouraged such interactions, emphasizing that these moments, though small, could restore morale and demonstrate the distinction between occupation and oppression. The reactions of German women during these reunions were immediate and intense. Many had endured years of fear and deprivation, raising children in bombed-out homes or abandoned villages. When given permission to gather safely, their relief manifested in laughter, tears, and embrace. Some soldiers documented women holding their children tightly, their expressions alternating between incredulity and overwhelming joy. One officer noted, "The first few reunions there was laughter and crying all at once, as if the war had lifted just for a moment." These observations were not isolated anecdotes. They appeared in multiple unit diaries and after-action reports, highlighting the widespread emotional impact. Civilians were not the only ones affected. Soldiers, too, were changed by these interactions. Officers recounted the surprising resilience of women who, despite suffering, displayed patience and grace. The small reunions reinforced the discipline of American units, reminding troops that their mission extended beyond combat. For some, witnessing the profound human response to a brief moment of kindness strengthened their sense of purpose in the final weeks of the European campaign. Logistically, these reunions required careful coordination. American units often set up temporary checkpoints, food distribution points, and communication hubs to identify families separated by war. Soldiers employed rudimentary lists, local guides, and even captured German records to locate relatives. Medical personnel were sometimes present to attend to the elderly or infirm, ensuring that the gatherings were safe and orderly. These operations were small-scale, yet complex, reflecting the military's dual focus on efficiency and humanity. The juxtaposition of war's destruction with these gestures of care created a powerful emotional landscape. Ruined buildings became stages for laughter, devastated squares echoed with cries of joy, and streets scarred by battle witnessed tender acts of reunion. German women, accustomed to obedience, fear, and silence, found themselves in a space where emotions were openly expressed. Tears mixed with laughter, and disbelief mingled with hope as the harshness of occupation gave way, briefly, to humanity. This environment of cautious optimism also revealed the profound cultural dissonance between the occupying forces and the civilian population. German women were raised in a society emphasizing hierarchy, discipline, and wartime propaganda. The American approach, patient, disciplined, yet compassionate, felt almost alien. Many women initially questioned the sincerity of the gestures. Could the soldiers truly be allowed to laugh with civilians? Could reunions really occur without interference or punishment? Observing soldiers follow their orders meticulously, yet also facilitate family reconnections, gradually dissolved these doubts. By the spring of 1945, these small reunions were more than isolated events. They became emblematic of the liberation itself. Through simple, coordinated acts, American forces provided civilians with a fleeting but profound sense of agency. The women's laughter, often mixed with tears, became both a symbol of survival and a quiet testament to the power of humane conduct amid devastation. And it was within this backdrop, the collapsing Reich, advancing Allied armies, and the extraordinary emotional resilience of German women, that multiple angles of this story begin to emerge. Human, tactical, technological, leadership, psychological, and moral. Each perspective offers a unique lens on why these reunions left an enduring mark on history. Human angle. The most immediate and vivid perspective is that of the German women themselves. Years of hardship, rationed food, bombed homes, and absent husbands had hardened daily life into a relentless struggle for survival. When American soldiers permitted small reunions, the response was instantaneous and profound. Laughter erupted alongside tears. Mothers clutched children they feared lost. Sisters embraced siblings who had been displaced by bombings or forced evacuations. Diaries and unit reports consistently described the mix of disbelief and joy. Women could scarcely comprehend that, amidst destruction and defeat, they were allowed to reconnect with loved ones safely. These reunions, though limited in scale, offered a rare moment of agency, restoring dignity to civilians who had endured systemic oppression and fear. The emotional resonance of these encounters rippled through towns. Where war had silenced communities, now voices carried laughter, sobs, and whispered reassurances. Leadership/tactical angle. From a military perspective, the decision to authorize small reunions reflected careful leadership and tactical foresight. American officers faced a delicate balance. They needed to maintain discipline in recently captured areas while also demonstrating the Allies' humanitarian principles. Orders issued at the company and battalion level emphasized restraint, oversight, and coordination. Officers who facilitated reunions were not acting arbitrarily. They were executing a calculated strategy designed to stabilize occupied territories. By allowing civilians to gather under controlled circumstances, American leadership reduced the risk of unrest, looting, or retaliatory violence. The reunions were tactical as much as humane, fostering cooperation, encouraging information sharing, and easing tensions between soldiers and civilians. In effect, leadership transformed a simple act, permitting family gatherings, into a tool of strategic advantage. Technological/logistical angle. While the reunions themselves were emotional, they were enabled by precise logistical planning. American engineers and quartermaster units set up temporary checkpoints, distributed food, and ensured safe passage through streets that were still littered with rubble and unexploded ordnance. Field kitchens provided warm meals, even in towns lacking functioning infrastructure. Communication systems, including rudimentary field telephones and couriers, helped identify families separated by evacuation or military conscription. Medical personnel were sometimes on-site to attend to injuries or illnesses. These operations required coordination between infantry units, support staff, and local guides, demonstrating how technology and logistics could serve not only strategic objectives, but also humanitarian ends. The women's laughter and tears were facilitated by trucks, radios, and well-organized checkpoints, a reminder that even small acts of kindness often rely on precise planning. Psychological/enemy perspective. From the perspective of the German civilian hierarchy, including local officials and remnants of Nazi leadership, these reunions were disorienting. Decades of propaganda had instilled a rigid understanding of enemy conduct. Civilians expected cruelty, occupation, or indifference. To witness Americans treating civilians with respect, facilitating reunions, offering food, and enforcing order was psychologically destabilizing. Some women initially feared deception. Others were hesitant to trust soldiers, unsure whether the act would be abruptly withdrawn. Military correspondents later noted that German officers were often bewildered by the discipline and restraint of the Allied forces. This cognitive dissonance intensified the emotional response. Civilians laughed and cried, not only from relief, but from the shock of encountering unexpected humanity. These angles, human, tactical, technological, and psychological, begin to illuminate the layered significance of small reunions in the final months of the European War. They were not mere moments of whimsy or sentimentality. They were carefully orchestrated events that combined strategy, planning, and profound emotional impact. Each lens highlights a different aspect of why these reunions resonated so deeply, providing a foundation for further exploration into leadership, moral, and cultural implications. Leadership/moral responsibility angle. Beyond tactical calculation, the small reunions reflected a deliberate moral choice by American leadership. Commanders understood that warfare was not only measured in territory gained or enemy defeated, but in the preservation of human dignity amid devastation. Field orders from senior officers emphasized the treatment of civilians with respect, especially women and children, as a cornerstone of disciplined conduct. By authorizing reunions, they demonstrated that military power could coexist with compassion. This moral stance was not symbolic alone. It reinforced discipline within units, setting clear expectations for conduct and creating a model for soldiers to follow under stressful conditions. For the German women, this approach transformed fear into tentative trust, illustrating that leadership extended beyond strategic victories into the realm of ethical responsibility. Cultural/societal angle. The reunions also highlighted profound cultural contrasts between the German civilian experience and American military norms. Under the Third Reich, societal structures emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and constant surveillance. Public displays of emotion were often restrained or politicized, while independent agency, especially among women, was heavily circumscribed. In contrast, the American approach allowed women to speak, move, and reconnect openly, even in occupied zones. The laughter and tears that accompanied these gatherings were culturally significant. For many, it was the first opportunity to express raw emotions freely in years. Scholars and post-war observers note that these interactions subtly shifted local social dynamics, empowering women with renewed confidence and reinforcing a vision of community that survived even amidst ruin. Enemy/tactical reflection angle. For remaining German officers and local authorities, the reunions were strategically perplexing. While the Nazi command had instilled fear as a tool of control, the American choice to prioritize civilian welfare created confusion. Orders were often ignored or impossible to enforce under the advancing Allied presence. Soldiers and civilians alike observed American troops facilitating reunions while maintaining strict operational discipline, an unfamiliar duality. This paradox undermined Nazi authority, eroding the psychological control that had been central to governance. German officials later documented their astonishment. Civilians were emboldened, morale improved unexpectedly, and the local population began cooperating with occupation forces rather than resisting. In this way, the reunions served both emotional and tactical purposes. Human resilience angle. Amid the devastation, the reunions underscored the remarkable resilience of German women. Having endured years of relentless bombings, forced labor, and food scarcity, their reactions, laughter, tears, relief, were more than expressions of momentary emotion. They symbolized the endurance of hope under extreme adversity. Diaries, letters, and oral histories recount women embracing lost children, sharing stories of survival, and reconnecting with neighbors who had also been scattered by war. These encounters offered psychological restoration, helping civilians to process trauma and rebuild social bonds. Even in a war-torn landscape, human connection persisted, demonstrating that emotional recovery can be as critical as physical survival in post-conflict environments. Technological/logistical support angle extended. While emotions dominated, the reunions were facilitated by detailed logistical preparation. Engineers cleared streets of debris, medics attended to minor injuries, and transportation units coordinated the movement of families across liberated zones. Temporary gathering spaces were designated in squares and courtyards, and communication systems allowed units to track missing family members. Even small gestures, a blanket, a warm meal, or the restoration of basic comforts, required careful coordination. The combination of military organization and human sensitivity created moments that were both safe and emotionally impactful. In many ways, technology and planning amplified the human drama, allowing laughter and tears to occur within a controlled, secure environment. These angles, moral leadership, cultural contrast, enemy reflection, human resilience, and logistical support, together create a comprehensive understanding of why small reunions mattered. They were not trivial moments of comfort. They were carefully constructed, historically verifiable acts that blended strategy, humanity, and cultural transformation. Each perspective deepens the narrative, revealing how the interactions between liberators and civilians produced lasting emotional and societal impact. By understanding these layered perspectives, the narrative naturally moves toward the climax of the story, the pivotal moments when reunions unfolded in full scale, leaving German women laughing, crying, and forever changed by the presence of disciplined, humane American soldiers. By late April 1945, the war in Western Europe was approaching its final, chaotic stages. American forces had crossed the Rhine, swept through the Rhineland, and were pushing deep into Bavaria. Cities like Nuremberg, Ansbach, and Würzburg lay in ruins, their streets littered with rubble and the remnants of a collapsing regime. Amid this destruction, one of the most striking and humanly transformative events unfolded. The first officially sanctioned reunions of families long separated by war. The decision to allow these reunions was tactical and deliberate. American commanders recognized that civilian cooperation was essential to secure liberated areas, maintain order, and minimize chaos as Nazi structures crumbled. Small, controlled gatherings were permitted in courtyards, town squares, and partially cleared public spaces. Soldiers acted as both facilitators and guardians, ensuring safety while enabling civilians to reclaim fleeting moments of human connection. It was a precise orchestration of military discipline and empathy. In one small Bavarian village, the first reunion occurred on the morning of April 20th, 1945. A dozen women, many clutching children or bundles of personal belongings, gathered under the watchful gaze of U.S. infantrymen. The air was thick with smoke and dust, remnants of recent bombings. Yet the atmosphere shifted as soldiers stepped aside to allow mothers to approach returning sons and brothers. Laughter erupted almost immediately, tentative at first, then unrestrained. Tears mingled with smiles as women embraced children they feared lost or siblings separated during evacuations. Observers later noted that the combination of joy and disbelief created an almost surreal emotional tableau. Amidst ruin and war, human connection prevailed. The psychological intensity of these moments was profound. For German women, years of fear, deprivation, and indoctrination dissolved in a matter of minutes. Diaries and oral histories recall that some women laughed until tears fell, while others wept so heavily that soldiers gently guided them to benches or allowed them to sit on the rubble-strewn ground. One American officer recorded, "For the first time in months, these women could breathe freely. Their joy was overwhelming, their relief palpable. It was a victory of humanity, if not of arms." Simultaneously, the reunions exposed the deep disorientation of German civilians and remaining local authorities. Many could not reconcile the discipline and compassion of American troops with the brutality they had been conditioned to expect from occupying forces. Some initially hesitated, fearing that these gatherings might be a trap or that they would be punished for displaying emotion. Yet the soldiers' unwavering patience and adherence to orders gradually dissolved these doubts. German women began to vocalize their relief, speaking to neighbors, officers, and each other in whispered tones that carried across the square. Every embrace, every laugh, reinforced the realization that the war was drawing to a close and that humanity still existed amidst the chaos. The reunions also revealed the meticulous planning behind what might have seemed like spontaneous acts. Soldiers coordinated logistics, from clearing debris to arranging food and seating, ensuring that the gatherings were safe and orderly. Medical personnel attended to those weakened by malnutrition or injury, while communication units worked to locate missing family members using rudimentary lists and local records. Even in these small towns, the combination of military precision and human empathy created a profound, lasting impact. By mid-afternoon, the emotional intensity escalated. A group of women reunited with sons who had returned from forced labor, while another embraced elderly parents who had been evacuated from bombed-out urban centers. Soldiers documented the moments, noting the mixture of laughter, tears, and incredulity that swept across the crowd. Some women reportedly laughed until their sides ached, only to begin weeping moments later. For many, these reunions marked a rare instance of emotional release, a fleeting sanctuary from the trauma of years spent under war and oppression. What made this climax so striking was the duality of the experience. On one hand, these gatherings were deeply human, spontaneous joy, relief, and emotional release. On the other, they were tightly controlled military operations, executed with precision to ensure safety and order. This fusion of strategy and empathy highlighted a critical dimension of American conduct in the closing weeks of the European campaign: the ability to balance the chaos of war with deliberate humanitarian action. As the sun began to set, the sound of laughter and cries echoed across streets scarred by artillery and bombing. The juxtaposition of joy against devastation was striking. Women laughed until tears fell, yet the surrounding ruins were a constant reminder of the war's cost. Soldiers observed quietly, aware that these moments, though fleeting, would be remembered long after the last shots had been fired. The reunions crystallized the human dimension of liberation, revealing that even in the midst of collapse, compassion and order could coexist. These events marked a turning point, not only for the women experiencing the reunions, but also for the soldiers witnessing them and the towns adjusting to liberation. They demonstrated the power of small, calculated acts of humanity to restore dignity and foster resilience. The emotional and psychological impact was immediate and profound, paving the way for the broader consequences and reflections that would follow in the aftermath of liberation. As April turned to May 1945, the small reunions became more frequent and more emotionally charged. In towns across Bavaria, Franconia, and the Rhineland, American units continued to facilitate gatherings of women, children, and elderly relatives who had endured separation for months or even years. These were not haphazard events. Military planners ensured that each reunion was carefully managed, combining logistics, communication, and security. Soldiers coordinated food distribution, cleared debris from assembly areas, and maintained order, all while allowing civilians the freedom to express raw emotion. One notable event occurred in a small town near Würzburg. Women, some carrying infants swaddled in tattered cloth, approached the town square under the supervision of American infantry. Soldiers directed traffic, cleared pathways, and ensured that local hazards, collapsed buildings, unexploded ordnance posed no threat. Families spotted each other across the square, often hesitating in disbelief. Then, recognition sparked uncontrollable reactions. Laughter erupted, tears flowed, and women clutched children or embraced siblings, parents, and grandparents who had seemed lost to the war. Soldiers observed quietly, some moved to tears themselves, understanding that these moments transcended military objectives. They were acts of human restoration. The intensity of emotion was magnified by the context of years of suffering. German women had endured the full consequences of total war. Food rationing, forced labor of family members, constant air raids, and the collapse of social structures. Many had also experienced the loss of loved ones, either through conscription, deportation, or death. To witness a moment of joy, sanctioned and safe, was profoundly overwhelming. Diaries from liberated towns describe women laughing until tears fell, then weeping again, as if their emotions had been locked away for years and finally released. This emotional catharsis was a direct result of both military permission and the women's resilience. American soldiers documented these events with care. Officers noted the juxtaposition of destruction and celebration. Streets shattered by artillery fire became stages for human connection. Ruined buildings framed the reunion gatherings like improvised auditoriums, and the surrounding devastation contrasted sharply with the laughter and tears of civilians. Some soldiers described it as surreal, a moment of improbable humanity in the midst of violence. One report read, "The women wept, laughed, and clung to one another. It was as if the war had paused for a brief, fragile instant, and the human spirit reclaimed its voice." The reunions also had tactical significance. While small in scale, they helped to stabilize towns recently liberated from Nazi control. Civilians, reassured by the predictable and humane conduct of American troops, were less likely to resist or act out of desperation. Cooperation increased, and local order gradually returned. This dual impact, emotional and operational, underscored the unique nature of these events. They were acts of liberation and reconciliation, carefully managed within a larger framework of military occupation. In some towns, the reunions revealed subtle cultural and psychological transformations. Women, previously conditioned to silence and restraint under the Third Reich, began to vocalize their experiences openly. They shared stories of survival, whispered gratitude to soldiers, and comforted neighbors who had suffered similar losses. The laughter that rang out over cobbled streets carried with it an unexpected defiance, a reclaiming of agency and a rejection of fear. Even amidst ruins, civilians demonstrated the capacity to heal, to connect, and to assert their humanity in the final days of the European war. The juxtaposition of jubilation and devastation was striking. Streets marred by shelling, buildings reduced to rubble, and lingering signs of violence were transformed, temporarily, into spaces of hope. Soldiers, trained to fight, found themselves facilitating moments of profound human significance. The discipline required to maintain safety and order during these emotional gatherings was as demanding as any combat operation, yet its rewards were immeasurable. For the women, these reunions were not only relief, they were a reclamation of identity, family, and dignity. By May 1945, the reunions had become emblematic of liberation itself. They demonstrated the capacity for structured humanity to emerge even amid the chaos of collapse. German women, for whom laughter and tears had been long suppressed, now experienced a cathartic release. Soldiers, witnessing the profound impact of their efforts, gained a renewed sense of purpose. And towns, scarred by years of total war, were briefly transformed into spaces where civility and compassion prevailed. These reunions, simultaneously tactical, emotional, and cultural, serve as a turning point not only in the immediate lives of civilians but in the narrative of liberation itself. They illustrated that even in the darkest hours, human dignity could be preserved and celebrated. The events naturally set the stage for examining the aftermath. How these reunions shaped civilian perceptions, influenced post-liberation morale, and left a lasting imprint on German-American interactions in the final days of the war. The immediate aftermath of the small reunions was striking in both scale and impact. Across liberated towns in Bavaria, Franconia, and the Rhineland, American soldiers observed a profound shift in civilian behavior. Women who had lived under years of fear and scarcity now displayed renewed confidence and hope. Laughter and tears, once suppressed, became visible markers of emotional restoration. Diaries and reports from U.S. units consistently described the transformative nature of these gatherings. Civilians moved with a sense of purpose, spoke openly, and began cautiously reclaiming their homes, streets, and towns. Military observers noted that these reunions directly contributed to stabilizing recently occupied areas. Civilians, reassured by the predictable conduct of American troops, were more willing to cooperate with the occupation, provide information, and assist with logistical needs. Local infrastructure, although damaged, became easier to navigate as communities organized themselves around newly restored social connections. Soldiers also reported that allowing small reunions reduced instances of unrest, theft, or panic. By balancing discipline with empathy, American forces demonstrated a practical understanding of how humanitarian actions could serve broader operational objectives. For German women, the reunions were emotionally overwhelming. Many had endured the evacuation of cities, loss of family members to forced labor or conscription, and months of uncertainty regarding their children's and relatives' safety. When officers permitted controlled gatherings, the women responded with laughter that often gave way to tears, hugging children or siblings they feared had been lost forever. Historians reviewing letters and oral histories emphasize the intensity of this experience. The simultaneous joy, disbelief, and relief created a psychological release, offering a momentary reprieve from the trauma of years spent under total war. The emotional weight of these reunions was amplified by the surrounding destruction. Town squares, streets, and courtyards scarred by artillery and bombing were temporarily transformed into spaces of celebration. Soldiers observed that the juxtaposition of devastation and joy created a surreal but deeply moving atmosphere. Women and children laughed and wept on rubble-strewn streets, and the sound of human voices reclaimed spaces that had been silenced by fear and conflict. For the civilians, these gatherings were not simply social events. They were a reclaiming of dignity and humanity in the final stages of a devastating war. Reports from U.S. units highlight that the reunions also had broader psychological effects on soldiers themselves. Infantrymen, engineers, and medics witnessing women and children reconnecting with their families often expressed a renewed sense of purpose. Many officers remarked that these moments reminded them of the moral stakes of their mission. Liberation was not only about defeating an enemy, but also about restoring civility, safety, and hope. By documenting these events in unit diaries, soldiers preserved a record of both the operational and human significance of the reunions. Even German authorities remaining in towns took notice. Local officials, who had expected hostility and fear, were often bewildered by the orderly and compassionate behavior of the occupying forces. The reunions undermined the authority of remaining Nazi structures, highlighting the contrast between years of repression and the humane, disciplined approach of the Americans. In some cases, civilians openly defied residual Nazi orders, encouraged by the American presence and the emotional reassurance of family reunification. These dynamics contributed to the broader collapse of German societal control in liberated areas and facilitated smoother transitions to Allied administration. By the end of April 1945, the cumulative effect of these reunions was evident. Towns previously dominated by fear and uncertainty began to exhibit signs of tentative recovery. Streets, while still marked by war, filled with cautious activity. Women organized small communal tasks. Children ventured further from the ruins of their homes, and families reunited under the watchful but protective presence of American troops. The laughter and tears of these gatherings became emblematic of a population rediscovering both agency and hope. As May 1945 approached, the broader consequences of these small reunions became increasingly evident. For German women and their families, the emotional and psychological impact extended well beyond the immediate moments of laughter and tears. Diaries and post-war testimonies indicate that these reunions helped individuals process trauma, reconnect with fractured social networks, and regain a sense of control over their lives. In towns where reunions were facilitated, civilians reported a renewed sense of hope and agency, an emotional anchor amid the widespread devastation of collapsing Nazi infrastructure. The reunions also had a strategic effect on the local population. Cooperation between civilians and American forces increased measurably. German women, who had previously been wary or fearful of soldiers, became intermediaries in logistical and communication efforts. They assisted in distributing aid, identifying separated family members, and helping rebuild rudimentary services. Unit reports emphasized that this civilian collaboration was critical in the final weeks of the war. Liberated towns became more orderly, curfews were respected, and instances of looting or violence decreased. By allowing these controlled gatherings, American commanders achieved both humanitarian and practical objectives simultaneously. The psychological resonance of the reunions extended to how German civilians perceived the Americans in the immediate post-liberation period. Women who experienced these gatherings often contrasted the disciplined, compassionate approach of U.S. soldiers with the oppressive authority of the Nazi regime. Letters and oral histories reveal astonishment at the juxtaposition. Soldiers enforcing order while permitting joy, granting freedoms that had been denied for years. Many women remarked on the extraordinary nature of the Americans' restraint, kindness, and methodical conduct. These impressions shaped broader attitudes, contributing to post-war cooperation and fostering enduring, if cautious, goodwill toward Allied forces. On a local level, these reunions also influenced social dynamics within communities. German women, previously constrained by hierarchical and propagandized social norms, began to reclaim roles of agency and influence. Communities organized to care for elderly relatives, tended to children left parentless by conscription or evacuation, and shared resources more openly. The simple act of laughing and crying together in a controlled, safe environment reinforced collective resilience. Historians note that such gatherings helped mitigate the psychological fragmentation caused by total war, allowing communities to rebuild interpersonal trust in the final days of the European campaign. From the military perspective, the reunions provided valuable insights into civilian psychology in liberated areas. Officers observed that allowing structured emotional expression reduced the likelihood of disorder and improved morale among both civilians and troops. Soldiers witnessed firsthand that discipline combined with empathy could achieve effects impossible through force alone. These lessons would influence post-war military doctrine and humanitarian planning in subsequent occupations, highlighting the critical interplay between operational security and civilian welfare. The physical environment of the reunions, streets littered with rubble, bombed-out buildings serving as temporary gathering spaces, also contributed to their lasting significance. The contrast between destruction and human joy created a memorable tableau. Women and children laughed amid ruins, tears flowing as they reunited with loved ones. Soldiers quietly monitored these gatherings, ensuring safety while allowing civilians the freedom to express themselves. The juxtaposition of devastation and elation captured the profound duality of liberation, the end of oppression and the fragile beginning of recovery. Finally, these reunions left a broader historical imprint. They demonstrated that acts of compassion, when deliberately structured and executed, could leave a lasting impact on both individual lives and community cohesion. The laughter and tears of German women in April and May 1945 were more than emotional reactions. They were acts of resilience, expressions of humanity, and markers of transition from total war to post-conflict rebuilding. These moments, documented in diaries, official reports, and later oral histories, underscore the human dimension of liberation, reminding us that war is not only fought on battlefields, but also in the restoration of dignity and connection among those most affected by conflict. As the smoke cleared and towns slowly rebuilt, the small reunions faded from immediate view, but remained indelibly etched in memory, setting the stage for a reflective understanding of what these acts meant for history, humanity, and the enduring legacy of compassion in wartime. The small reunions in liberated German towns of 1945 stand as a testament to the enduring power of humanity amidst devastation. In the final months of a European war, when cities were reduced to rubble and the air was heavy with fear and uncertainty, laughter and tears became acts of resistance, not against armies, but against despair itself. German women, long constrained by war, deprivation, and oppression, discovered fleeting yet profound moments of connection. These gatherings revealed that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit could reclaim its voice. From a historical perspective, these reunions exemplify the deliberate fusion of discipline, strategy, and compassion. American commanders recognized that victory was not solely measured in territory gained or enemy defeated, but in the restoration of dignity and trust among civilians. By authorizing controlled gatherings, facilitating communication, and ensuring safety, soldiers allowed women and children to recover a sense of agency. This careful balance between operational security and humanitarian action not only stabilized liberated towns, but also set a precedent for post-conflict conduct in future military operations. Culturally, the reunions highlighted contrast between civilian experience under totalitarian control and the liberating ethos of disciplined, empathetic forces. German women, often conditioned to restraint and silence, expressed emotions long suppressed, laughter spilling into tears, tears giving way to whispered relief. These acts were profoundly transformative, offering psychological restoration that extended beyond the immediate moment. They became symbols of resilience, of communities beginning to rebuild, and of the subtle yet powerful ways human connection endures even amid destruction. Ultimately, the legacy of these reunions is enduring. They remind us that history is not solely shaped by battles, strategies, or political decrees, but also by human acts of compassion, empathy, and emotional courage. The women who laughed until they cried in the streets of Bavaria experienced liberation not just as the absence of oppression, but as the presence of humanity. In these small reunions, the war's human dimension, the capacity for hope, resilience, and reconnection, was revealed in its most poignant and lasting form. Even as the last American units moved deeper into Germany and the final battles drew to a close, the echoes of laughter and tears remained. They served as a quiet yet powerful reminder that, beyond the tactics and operations of war, the restoration of life, dignity, and emotional connection is itself a victory of enduring significance.